Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Brad and Mr. Spencer here, and today we're talking about a day in the life of an internal pen tester specifically. And so for that, obviously we have Spencer on board. That's his primary focus within our organization, and he's really good at it. So I think he's a good person to speak to it. I have some experience, but it's a little bit dated. So I'll kind of throw in, my past experience as I can. But what was your kind of, I guess your reason for making this video? What kind of, drove that decision?
Yeah. So this episode kind of, I was thinking about our pen test process and just pen testing in general. And, in talking with clients and people who do not pen test all day long, like we do, I think some of it is a mystery, right? And, we'll do an engagement, right? And, we'll do an internal and, I'll find out at the end of the test, right? But like the IT team, department had me up on their screen, right? Because I'm remoted into their machine with a remote access tool, and they have it up on a TV, right? And they're, doing their work or eating lunch and watching, right? And they always say to me, like, oh, I never thought it was just, searching through file shares. Like it's not very exciting to watch. It's rather boring. It's not like the movies or Mr. Robot. It's not like the Matrix and like you're in the console and like all this stuff scrolling by. So I feel like there's some mysticism behind it almost in a way.
There is.
So I thought maybe, shed some light on kind of inside the inner workings of somebody who does pen testing as a job, as opposed to somebody who's an IT admin or a CISO or something like that. You can kind of hopefully get some appreciation for where we're coming from and how we attack things, how we document things, or how we kind of approach certain vulnerabilities or problems. So I have kind of different categories of, phases of an engagement. And I thought maybe just share some thoughts and things that I think about that maybe we don't necessarily say to the client, but that we're thinking, right? It's our process, it's our workflow, it's how we kind of work and operate. I thought that would be maybe an interesting episode. So if you listen to that 35-second spiel about what this is about, I appreciate it, and hopefully you get value from this.
Yeah, for sure. So one quick note, folks, if you like what we're doing, make sure you like, subscribe, share it with your friends. It's really helpful for us. All right, man. So how do you prepare for an internal penetration test? Like, what's your process?
Yeah, so I think that's the first step is, preparation. Oftentimes for me on an internal pen test, preparation starts weeks in advance. Particularly if I'm pen testing against, if I know I'm pen testing against like an antivirus or an EDR product that I've never tested against. Right now, it's really common to pen test against CrowdStrike. It's like all over the place. It's like 99% of what you see, and I'm sure if
You
you're
probably get tired of it, don't you?
you're like, yeah, I know, me too. So yeah, in some ways, I kind of wish I had more of a variety, but if product works, it works. But on many times, I'm pen testing against an AV product or EDR product that I haven't pen tested against before. So I'll go out and I will see if I can get a trial, right? Or I'll see if we have it internally, or we'll try and get access to that so that we can test certain things. We can test payloads, we can test tools, kind of see what we're walking into to get a sense. And that's because part of our internal pen test process is a little bit of stealth, not super advanced, not a red team or anything like that, but we do like to kind of go under the radar a little bit, just to kind of push the needles a little bit, or push the detection capabilities a little bit of the client's environment, so that we're not just running Mimikatz on day one, right? We want to test, can we do things gradually and kind of gradually get louder and louder and louder and kind of figure out where that point is where things start to get detected. So that's part of it. Another thing I do is OSINT, just kind of researching the client, right? Looking at their website. What do they do? What business are they in? What states they operate in? Do they have offices, physical office locations, or are they completely remote? All that stuff is helpful, especially when you're creating word lists. So you get hashes in environment on a pen test and you want to crack them. Maybe they're using the street address or the street name and the address as a password, or maybe they're using the name of the street and the date the organization was incorporated, right? Like main 1850 bang or something like that, right? And that's
incredibly common. We see that. We also see like if they're in a in a city that has like an NFL football team,
common.
right? They'll use that. If they have a lot of state pride, like Texas, the people out of Texas love Texas. Texas is awesome, but they'll use Lone Star State, and then the year and stuff like that. So we do get some benefit, from geographically understanding the area that they're from.
Yep. And that works for externals, works for internals, a number of different types of engagements, and just kind of doing some OSINT on the organization.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I prepare for and kind of how I'm prepping, how I prep for an engagement. Not just client time, meeting with the client and doing pre-engagement work and kickoff calls and talking to them, but actual hands-on keyboard, just OSINT, tool development, writing scripts, or working on tools, making obfuscating tools, and kind of getting things ready to go for the engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So another part of that, the planning and preparation I want to mention is talking with the client. So in a kickoff call or pre-engagement calls, I like to ask, what information is important? What are the important systems or important processes? What is success to you on an engagement like this? What would be a successful measure to show like, hey, there's this issue here, or how can we or more or less just help you guys with any pain points. So maybe there's a system that clients are worried about, or there's a section in their network that they're not sure what kind of lays out there. I like to ask those questions in the pre-engagement, because we have a limited time, and the more you can share with us of like, here's these things we're worried about, the more we can focus on that and kind of help show you what the risks are of those things. Or maybe you're solid there, and we can kind of help articulate that in the reporting and throughout the pen test process.
Yeah, agreed. I think this exploratory process is often overlooked because it's easy for pen testers to get into this routine where we come in and we have this process and we do the things. But there are varying variances in client goals and objectives and things like that. And this discovery process helps a lot in finding out what that is.
Yeah. And, it's part of the reason why I talk about goals, is to your point, it's not just smash and grab, run tools and, get domain admin and, get creds and all that stuff. Our process is really designed to help show where you're weak, where you're strong, where you can get better, and kind of show you where those things are so that you can improve those things. In my mind, all of this goes back to client value and risk to the organization. So that's why we do it, and that's kind of behind the scenes, kind of like in my mind of how I'm thinking about kind of preparing for an engagement. Is I have a limited time, and I want to provide as much value as I can, and make sure I focus on the things that are most important to that organization.
Right.
So execution. So, okay, we prepared. Now we are, sitting down in our chair for an engagement, right? Something, I thought maybe we would talk about is, what are the first couple steps, right? Like, what am I thinking? What am I doing on an engagement? So after we get access to a machine, I sit down in my chair day one. One of the first things I do on an internal SIM breach pen test is just situational awareness, right? What security products are there? What software is installed? Are there any scheduled tasks that have been created? I look at the services. I kind of do, like a 120-point inspection of the endpoint itself.
Yep.
I look at everything from group policy to credentials to the software that's installed. I look for vulnerabilities in that software. I look for exploits and POCs and all that stuff, to see kind of how well guarded and defended that endpoint is.
Right.
And that's a big reason why I spend so much time on the endpoint, and kind of analyzing it, reviewing it, looking for configuration mistakes or things that the client can do better to harden that environment. Many times it's a lot of simple things that clients can do, like getting rid of .NET 2 so you can't downgrade PowerShell, or implementing stricter software patching, right?
Yeah.
Just simply patching third-party software, right, can eliminate a lot of risk in your environment. So simple things like that, all the way to more complex things like application control or app blocker, credential guard, and things like that you can use to harden those endpoints.
Yeah, and for those of you that don't know, the industry has taken a move away from network-based internal penetration testing towards more assumed breach model, and that's where we start out on a machine, right? And it's under the assumption that a breach has occurred, which is I could probably explain that a little bit better than a breach has occurred, but it's under the assumption that the attacker has a foothold in your environment, and it's going to start on an endpoint more likely than not. There's two huge benefits to that, right? Number one is that we get to leverage what's on the machine like an attacker really would to move laterally, but also we get to take the time to evaluate the endpoint, which does not occur on internal network penetration testing unless you're lucky enough to pivot to a workstation, which may or may not happen depending on where you drop your tools. So that's really important distinction. And believe it or not, and Spencer, I don't even know if you knew this, but I was talking to somebody this week and they were like, yeah, our pen test, last time was they dropped a Kali box, as a VM. And I was like, bruh, like 2018 called and they want their pen test back. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, there is some value in those types of assessments.
Sure,
obviously, there is. It's why organizations are still doing them. But the clients that we see, feel like there's a lot of realism in the way that we do the assumed breach. It's an actual foothold in the environment, right? And I think there's a level of realism and practicality from those types of engagements that you don't get with a network pen test that just starts with plugging into the client's network.
100%.
So going back to the execution real quick, what am I thinking and why? I want to get a sense, after I've done that initial endpoint stuff, I'll do even more OSINT and more internal OSINT on file shares and OneDrive or SharePoint, intranets. I'll look at document management systems if I have access to it. Essentially, I'll see what I have access to and I can log into. A lot of times organizations have single sign-on, right? So now I have access to Microsoft 365, probably an intranet, SharePoint, wherever the documents are, file shares. So I will do a lot of, somebody put it the other day, archaeology. It's like,
that's cool.
It's like, just discovering all of the skeletons that are out there on the engagement. So for example, one time on an engagement, I was digging through the file shares as I normally do, and I come across this randomly named folder, and I drill down into it like multiple levels deep, and then all of a sudden there's like these VMDK files out there.
Nice.
Looked like they were for a server, and I was like, that's odd. And it's like in this weird folder. You never would have found it unless you were just digging through it. I mounted that VMDK. I did a SAM dump of the thing, of the VMDK of the server, got the local administrator's hash, cracked that hash, and used that to pivot in the network to other servers that were using that same password.
Nice.
So real interesting stuff that you find in file shares. And again, a lot of this stuff you're not going to find unless you're digging through it. So I spend quite a bit of time digging through it, looking for those things. Because those aren't things that, you're necessarily going to find as an IT admin. They're out there and you forget about them. And there's a lot of trash and like stuff that's out there that have been accumulated. That's really hard to find if you're not just digging through it all the time.
Yeah, agreed. And so this kind of is in the same area of a point of discussion that I like to have with people. And this really goes for both clients and, peers and stuff like that. But this analogy I like to use, I'll probably catch some heat for it, but doing pen testing is like doing brain surgery, right? And now I don't have a degree in brain surgery, but it's how I imagine brain surgery would be. And the reason that I use that analogy is, imagine you spend all the time researching, all of the prep work for the patient to go sit in the OR, right? And then you have to like double scrub in. You've got an entire staff of people that are all there for you to do this job. And you get in and you get started and you get like 25% through it. And then your wife calls and she's like, you need to come home and mow the grass. So now you have to send all of those people away, stop doing what you're doing, right? And so you've interrupted that process. It's a stream of consciousness process, penetration testing is. And interruptions to that process, whether they be inability to access the endpoint that you're working from, whether they be, 5 or 6 hours of meetings that you have dropped in the middle, whatever it is, they interrupt the efficiency and the workflow of a penetration test. Like it should be for you I start this process in the morning, I work through it until I'm done, obviously take breaks. But the point is, the more you interrupt that process, the less efficient you're going to be. And the more difficult it is to complete that efficiently and effectively. And so, people who haven't done pen testing, they don't necessarily understand that, right? It doesn't make sense to them. But it is really hard to stop and start throughout the process, at least in my experience.
Yeah. And, it requires diligence in note taking, right?
Oh, yeah.
When I
Maybe
first
that's
started,
why it's so hard for me.
when I first started, right, I just took a few notes here or there and kind of document things. And then you come back the next day and you're like, I know this means something. One word in your notes, like, admin, you're like, shoot, what did that mean?
Yeah.
So it's important, and that's why I've kind of developed a note-taking system for myself of, documenting what's important, what to follow up on, things like that. So in my notes, I use triple exclamation mark. So like bang, 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 right? For a finding or a vulnerability, right? So if I find ESC1, I go bang, 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 ESC1, the template name, where I can find it, right? So I can go exactly to that thing and go and reference it. Same thing with stuff that clients are doing well. I'll do like a triple plus. So plus, 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 script block logging is enabled. Or there's application control is implemented in this environment, that kind of thing. Stuff that I refer back to later is triple star for me in my note-taking system. So I'll do a triple star and I'll document what the thing is, where to find it, how to go back to it, more or less documenting, what that thing is. So when I refer back to it later, I can easily recall that information. So the note-taking process, I think, is something that's not talked about a lot in the pen testing world, but it's definitely a skill in and of itself.
It is.
And it's something that can literally make or break a pen test. If you're not doing good, if you don't have good documentation, especially for a longer engagement, you're going to miss things, miss out on valuable information, misrepresent things, and stuff like that. So note-taking is really important so that we're providing as much value as we can to the client.
Agreed. And I think it does help a little bit if you can report as you go, right? If you can just, even if you don't completely do the entire, finding section, but just reporting the valid information into whatever your reporting system is. For us, we use Stratus. That helps a lot so that when you get to the end of it, you're not having to remember what you did on Monday.
Yep. Yeah. Especially the screenshots, documenting the thing, taking a screenshot, and having all that information so that when you look at the screenshot again in your report, you're like, I know exactly what that means because I have notes, I've got annotations. If you just take a screenshot of like your screen, it's like, shoot, what was that? I know that means something, right? And again, it just all goes back to, using our time effectively to provide the most value to the clients. So pivoting from kind of like execution to post-exploitation, right? Let's say we found a vulnerability. Right, we're on a pen test. We found a vulnerability. Maybe it's, I'll use a really good example. Right, so I was on a pen test once, and I found a vulnerability in the Splashtop application. So like, there's this remote software called Splashtop. There's this client that gets installed on endpoints. Well, that had a vulnerability. That vulnerability was discovered by somebody from the Mandiant Red team, I think. But there was no POC for it. It was just a description. It was just a vulnerability description. It said, here's what it is. It described the vulnerability. This is what happens. Here's the impact, blah, blah, blah. So on the engagement, I found this vulnerable software, right? It's like, okay, it's vulnerable. I can mark it off, right? I have two options, right? I can mark it off and say, hey, it's vulnerable. Here's the CVE. Or, I can show the impact of it, right? It said it was a local privilege escalation vulnerability, but I don't really know unless I test it, right? I can trust it if I want, right, and move on, or I can create a POC for it. So I created a POC for it. I reversed that vulnerability. on my own system. I downloaded the software on my own VM, tested it out, figured out how it worked with Procmon and stuff like that. Reversed the vulnerability, wrote an exploit for it, used it on the client's environment. It works great. Now I showed like, hey, here's this vulnerability. It's got this rating. It's a local privilege escalation vulnerability, and here's me actually using it to elevate privileges. Oh, and by the way, your AV didn't detect it, and here's how you can kind of go about detecting things like this and that kind of stuff. So
cool.
That is hugely important to not just say, hey, here's this vulnerability. Here's a proof of concept that shows, yes, this is an actual vulnerability. Here's the risk. We exploited it. Here's how to, detect it, kind of thing.
Yep. Love it, man.
So that, that's kind of what an ideal process looks like for, validating a vulnerability. Not every vulnerability is going to be that way. But as much as possible, we're trying to show validation in a pen test report, right? We're not just trying to run a scan and say, hey, here's this thing. We do want to try and show the impact of those vulnerabilities, so the client can make that judgment decision on the risk of that actual finding. So that's a little bit of behind the scenes kind of post exploitation, vulnerability documentation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, when possible, to go ahead and step through that, right? Because there is a substantial difference in seeing you gaining a higher level of privilege on a system and you referencing a CVE and saying, hey, I saw this version was, below the version that was fixed or whatever. There's just a different impact to the client, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a level of, there's a level of fun in it, right? That's fun to do, like reverse a CVE disclosure and create an exploit for it. But also it's validation for the client to say, if you're hiring a pen tester and they're reversing CVEs into exploits, I don't know. I mean, I'm biased because it's me, but I think that's pretty not a sophisticated thing, but I think that's a more advanced thing for a pen test firm to be able to reverse CVEs into exploits,
of course,
to show the risk to an organization, right? I think that's another step up in the maturity scale of a pen test firm. So I do think there is that level of professionalism that you get, with firms like that.
It gives you more confidence in the product.
Yeah. Yep. For sure.
All right. So what kind of common challenges are you faced with, and how do you deal with those in, from engagement to engagement?
Yeah. So this is a good one. And I added one in late today, called out of scope, right? One of the challenges, we see sometimes is clients will say, hey, we want to do this internal pen test, but our sensitive information is all over here. And it's, a third party thing, but it's out of scope, right? It's like, oh, okay. So the most important thing in your environment is out of scope. It's unfortunate, right? It's unfortunate that happens. And I get why clients do it. It's third party, or, it's not where it needs to be, and that kind of thing. I strongly urge clients to kind of figure out how to still include those in scope, while still maintaining, proper etiquette with third parties and relationships and stuff like that. So, calling something out of scope is a challenge, right? And it's a challenge for us as pen testers because we have to be mindful. We can't just, go anywhere we want. We have to be mindful of scope and respecting those boundaries that the client sets. So that's a challenge sometimes when you see, this thing could be vulnerable, but I can't really do anything because it's out of scope, right? So we have to say, hey, this thing looks like it might be there. We don't really know. We can't test it. It's out of scope. But we can still call it out where we see it and that kind of thing. So the out of scope thing is kind of challenging. And I'm sure you see this more. It's more common in externals, I think, than internals. A lot of times for our internals, they're like, yeah, just have at it, like do whatever you want.
Yeah,
which is fun for me. It's like everything is on the table. But
we see this a lot on externals and also on web apps. Because it's kind of hard to silo modern web applications because there's APIs, there's third-party libraries, there's all these moving parts, and it's not an uncommon thing for us to be chasing a thread, and that thread hit a system that if it's owned by a third party, yeah, I totally understand that. If it's some other system in the client's chain, and they're like, I don't want you messing with that, that's fair, but you should understand.
Yeah, and for example, the out of scope thing on an internal, the client gave me their internal environment information, the domains and forests and all that, and then there was these two subnets that were out of scope. Well, I had access to a server in that out of scope subnet. And I could see that based on looking at the local admins of all the groups on the servers. And I knew that I had admin access to that server, but it's in this range that's out of scope. And that server lives in the forest that I'm pen testing, right? But it's on a subnet that the client said was out of scope. So it was in the forest, it's domain joined, out of scope, but we have, admin access to the server. So those are the kind of things that are tricky. Like, okay, a threat actor is going to pivot to that machine because they know they have access to it. They have admin on that box. So those are the things that are
so bad guys don't have scopes.
That's right. The last thing that's challenging is things that clients are doing well. So things that are like wins for the client. So when the AV or EDR product is working really well and you can't really get anything going, that's awesome. We love to see that. That's a challenge for us as pen testers. Application control, strict like app locker kind of thing. PowerShell script execution, strict restriction there. So the other things that are challenging for us are things that are usually wins for the client, things that they're doing well. And those are things that we like to see, we like to have in our way, so we can call those out in the reports.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, while they are wins, we kind of preach the don't put all your eggs in one basket, security through a layered defense, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we do find that, the client's not going to get value because this one thing is such a win for them, how do we handle that?
Yep. Yeah. And it's like, if we can't get any tooling going on an endpoint, right? It's like everything we try, we try bypasses, we try evasion, we try obfuscation. There's nothing we can do to get it going. Like, hey, like this endpoint's pretty good. Like EDR is working great. You guys are seeing everything. Let's move to an endpoint that doesn't have it so we can continue testing and provide value for the week of testing that we have here.
Yeah.
So we're not just, bullying this thing in the ground, just trying to get something going on the endpoint, so that, you actually get value from the test that you guys paid for.
Yeah. And, the other part of that too is the strength of EDR platforms, which I'm using that as an obvious example because it fits perfectly in the conversation, but it could be anything. Could be WAF, could be, could be egress filtering, whatever. That ebbs and flows. The strength of these individual products ebbs and flows. It's again part of the reason we preach, a layered defense, but also, tomorrow a bypass might get dropped on GitHub that just turns CrowdStrike off. Right. And so now all the bad guys have that. And until it's fixed, that exists in your environment. And so if we don't test past that, you have absolutely no idea what that looks like beyond. And now all of a sudden, your pants are down with this bypass floating around in common circulation. So that's the reason that we move past those. And we don't just sit there and be like, oh, I guess you win, there's just no value in that. So.
Yep, definitely.
Cool, man. Anything else to add?
I think that's it. I mean, I think I went through most of the stuff. I hope that was informative, and maybe I'm hoping that was kind of a behind the scenes and kind of some of the thought process behind what we do on an internal pen test. It's not exhaustive by any means, and a lot of times it's very situational. It's based on the environment, the tooling that's security tools that are there, software applications that are present, and things like that. That kind of gives you an idea of a day in the life of kind of what we go through in some areas of the testing phase. So hopefully that was informative or entertaining for you folks.
Yeah, for sure, man. So that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening / watching, depending on what platform you're catching us on. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, comment, share, etc. And also step on over to our offset.blog, right? We got some pretty cool stuff over there, in some white papers and some different things are developing. So check that out. And of course, securit360.com, where we're from. So, and we are posting every Wednesday. So have been for some time. So check us out next week. See you folks.